I can have a business and I can lobby Congress to go slap penalties and fines and barriers to entry on my competitors. So you can't do it yourself, but you can legally lobby Congress to do it for you.
Right. And that's, of course, one of the problems of concentrated benefits and diffused costs. Like the profits of state lobbying are privatized and the costs are socialized, which is one of the reasons why it always grows. But you say, well, anarchy can't exist, but you live in a state of voluntarism, of non-hierarchical coercion with all of your relationships, I would argue. When you go on TV, when you work with Asia Pacific Capital and you promote it, it's all voluntary. So it can exist. And you look in the mirror. You're an example of a voluntary society.
But we're not talking about anarchy in the terms of individual interpersonal relationships. We're talking about from a society level. Is there going to be some kind of central level of authority, a government? And I think if there is no government, then society, somebody is going to try to steal or rob, and then society is going to try to organize in some way to protect itself from that kind of threat. And the minute you get that kind of organization, you now have a government. I mean, the government just kind of comes in as people get together and decide to act in concert with one another. This is Peter Schiff with Stefan Molyneux, radio talk show host and author advocate of anarchy, as opposed to, I guess, the type of government we have now. And, Stefan, in America, the government is so bad that I would definitely choose anarchy over what we got today. Even though I don't believe anarchy would survive indefinitely, I would take my chances on whatever government might spontaneously develop one day, because I figure it couldn't possibly be as bad as what we got now.
Right. I mean, if you've got a terminal cancer, you want it cut out, and it's like, well, maybe it'll grow back later, but that's less important than getting it out now. And I think, just look at some data. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, though, is if you're trying to, move the needle on this and go away from big government towards less government, I think if you try to go all the way to anarchy, which a lot of people would, look at as chaos, I think it undermines our argument and makes it easier for our critics to say we're nuts. I think if you just argue for a smaller, limited government, where governments have a much smaller role, I think it's an easier argument to defend than to say that there should be no government whatsoever.
Well, I agree with you that it's easier to move the needle than it is to sort of flip the pancake, but I mean, Peter, I would argue also that if you want to change a fundamental moral paradigm in society, and in this one, I would argue that it's the acceptance of the use of violence to solve complex social problems like drug addiction, like poverty, like education, like old age healthcare and so on. If we're just going to wave guns around, laws, throw people in prison, print money like crazy, and think that we're solving these problems, you and I, I'm sure, we perfectly agree that doesn't work. If you're going to want to change a fundamental moral paradigm, you have to keep hitting that moral argument. If you want to get rid of slavery, you don't argue for less slavery, you argue for no slavery, that the institution is immoral, and that's the way I approach the state. Sorry, go ahead.
But you don't have to get rid of government completely to get government out of education. You don't have to get rid of government completely to end the war on drugs. I mean, we just have to enforce limited government and understand that force can only be used in a defensive manner by government, and government cannot redistribute wealth. If it collects money through taxation, the money has to be used for the legitimate purposes of government, not to redistribute wealth, no matter how worthwhile or the politicians might think a particular individual or group of individual is. The government cannot take money from one citizen and give it to another. Citizens have to choose on their own to support charitable causes or individuals who might be in need. When the government does it, we recognize that theft is theft, and it doesn't matter who does it. If somebody comes and forcibly takes your money and gives it to somebody else, that's not legal, and that's not a legitimate function of government.
Well, I agree with you that theft is theft, and it doesn't matter who does it. But explain this to me, and I don't mean this sarcastically. I'm genuinely open to the argument. I can't find an example where governments have stayed small. In fact, the smaller the governments begin, the larger they end up, because small governments generate huge wealth through a non-interference in free trade and through an enforcement of property rights. They generate huge wealth, which they use as collateral to borrow, to to print money, to go into debt, to bribe their friends and punish their enemies. How is the citizen supposed to control this monolithic monopoly of violence called the state? How is that enforcement supposed to happen?
There is no precedent for a government staying small. They always grow. But there's also no precedent for anarchy because governments always arise to fill that void. So it's going to happen. But yes, can we find a better way to keep government limited? I mean, that's what the founding fathers strived to do, and they succeeded, even though government began to grow almost immediately after the Constitution was ratified. We did hold a reign on government power that lasted over 100 years. And even though government gained power, it did it very slowly, and it had to take it little bits at a time. And as we were able to keep government small, we achieved unprecedented wealth and rising living standards in America. We have to try to replicate those checks on government, but I don't know that simply abolishing it completely is going to work either. I think that if we establish a very limited government from the get-go, I think we can control its growth better than having no government and then having a very powerful one emerge that we have no control over.
Right. Now, but the argument from historical non-precedents, like you show me an example of a society without a government, well, I don't think that's hugely relevant. I mean, it's important and we need to look at historical facts, but before the end of slavery, you could make the same argument. You can say, well, you show me a society that's functioned without slavery. All societies have slavery, and if you get rid of slavery, you'll simply create a slavery vacuum and you'll get it back again. But that hasn't happened, right? So if you get rid of an immoral institution, it doesn't always come back.
Though slavery wasn't a universal concept, it wasn't like every society had slavery. Even in America, I mean, you could look at the difference between the North, where there was very little slavery, and the South, and the North was more prosperous. The North was the economic juggernaut, and that was not built on slave labor. These were free people who were employed.
No, look, I agree with you. I'm not just talking about the American example, but if you go back far enough in history, almost all societies had slavery, and then you could make the argument and say, well, no societies had no slavery before, therefore it can't work. But once you make that moral argument, you argue for equal rights for women, which is a relatively unprecedented phenomenon, new to the West, thank heavens. If you argue for the end of slavery, if you argue for rights for children, and you make that moral argument successfully, society does pass through a threshold, and it seems almost impossible to make it go back in time. Nobody argues for slavery anymore. Nobody argues for the subjugation of women or, throwing children down the mines or whatever. Once you do cross that moral threshold, it does seem to stick pretty well in society. Society doesn't usually slide back. I think the same thing could equally be true of statism if we make the moral argument compellingly enough. And I don't know how to make a compelling moral argument without going for maximum consistency. And the maximum consistency of the non-aggression principle is thou shalt not initiate the use of force against others, which means you can't have a monopoly of violence. I think the most consistent argument will win.
Even if you think that anarchy is some type of ideal, how do you get there? I mean, how would you get either in Canada or the U.S. from a system of massive government to no government at all? I mean, how would you even achieve such a monumental shift? I mean, wouldn't you need like some kind of violent revolution? And then you would have to assume that the revolutionaries, once they, achieve power themselves, they relinquish it all and step back.
Oh, Peter, but this is why I'm on your show. You have the kind of media power that by the time we're finished this conversation, it should be a done deal. I'm looking forward to opening my browser when we're done and saying all laws have been repealed and we're all now free.
Yeah, I couldn't even get the nomination for a Senate seat in the Republican Party talking about limited government. How are we going to abolish it completely? But anyway, look, it's an interesting theoretical discussion. It's going to have to remain a theory because I don't see it being a practical reality anytime soon. But we can always strive to limit the size of government. The smaller the better. The closer we can get to anarchy, probably the happier and the freer and the more prosperous we will all be. But Stefan, thanks for coming on the show. Everybody, we got a full hour of the Peter Schiff Show coming up, so don't go away. We will be right back.